Consilience, COVID, and Youth Ministry, February 21st, 2022. A definition of consilience: the linking together of principles from different disciplines, especially when forming a comprehensive theory. These things shouldn't be related in a meaningful way, other than the light one shone on the other during some of the darkest days of the Western teenager had faced in some time. But COVID and youth ministry both showcase a curious pattern that caused me to stop and think recently, and I have to take a stab at explaining it. When I was a youth pastor, I ran the math on how many kids were part of an active youth program in the town my church was in, and how many kids were in the age demographic of all youth programs offered in the same demographic. When I mapped the two numbers together, I got a fairly simple graph, and I encouraged youth pastors to do for their own ministry at least once. Between my youth group, the 4-H club, and the Mormon Church's youth program, 1% to 2% of the town's youth was involved in a faith-based or faith-adjacent, being located in a church but not for gospel-oriented purposes, youth program. My goal was, until I was asked to leave for an overtly evangelical method in practice, was to get that number to something above 3% by aiming at 10%, and to have to get 10% because of my church. Long story short, it didn't work, but the percentage stuck with me. I could never figure out why. They seemed important, but I could never make it into something meaningful. And as a general rule, I advise never doing the math on any given topic. Here, the numbers point to something significant. The numbers being and behaving similarly, but from a different source and angle. That angle being churches that didn't enforce COVID mandates. In a different city with a few hundred churches, in the midst of a global pandemic, and among a long list of unprecedented things, the precedented number came up again, 1% to 2%. Consilience, as read above, is when two sets of principles link, forming a comprehensive theory, and somewhere between the small rural church youth pastorate and the large city church attender, the consilience of the average attendance of youth group and anti-mandate church linked up like Mennonites at a barn dance. Why? Because God is gracious. That's why. By any rational metric, youth ministries don't work. The ministry and time spent on them don't add up to statistical change in the demographic of teens that feed into them. Take your youth group's average attendance and then take a list of high schools and the middle schools represented there and divide the two numbers. Are you making a difference? The math would suggest no. But we all know what an ounce of salt does to a pound of hamburger. Where is God's grace? In the making of sufficient his strength through our weaknesses? Or did you want to call decades of populist parody youth men? Yes, youth ministry used to be 20 kids and now it's 40 kids. Did your church grow at that time too? If it did, you didn't grow your ministry. Your ministry grew with your church. And a very different thing than being the reason your youth ministry is above and beyond what a natural population demographic would forecast for any given church in your area. God's grace is that though by the metrics youth ministry might be counted as a net loss, by his desires and his will is still done. Your baptisms still count, your salvation stories still mean names in the book of life, and the worship that happens at the youth during worship time still magnifies the name of Christ. God's grace in providing for representative youth ministry is just as holy and wonderful as it would be for an explosive youth ministry, one that turned a whole graduating class into Baptists or baptized 4% to 6% of a city's grade 9s. But to conflate the two of both being successful in the same way would be questionable, which is why I'm asking the questions, because what really counts in youth ministry is that God's mission is being served and Christ's gospel is being preached. What counts is that the church is being the church. Because of all the things that we really need to nail down, the church being the church was on the top of the list during this pandemic. Because the church looked like it was a very drastic set of circumstances and made some very drastic changes in the last few years. Zoom church did not exist as orthodoxy before COVID, and now it questionably does. That's important because if it wasn't church, God's grace could compensate for it, and we would never know that what we were doing was a technical failure spared by an omnipotent and gracious God. We would never know that we are sinners saved by grace. The baptisms would still count, and so would the service to the poor, but we would have, at the very least, could have been not doing church at all. Doing what we thought was a missional, gospel-centered effort because it felt right and it was representationally valid. The consilience of 1% of churches in the area that refused to change was the Orthodox pre-COVID, refusing to gather exclusively online, refusing to worship in masks, refusing to stop meeting together, refusing to hum quietly, refusing to render to AHS which was not AHS's, lines up rather perfectly with the 1% of youth in an average youth group, just in the opposite direction. The genuine faith of 1% was never in question, but the methods of the 99 were up to sure were. If not, 1 out of 99 kids out of 100 aren't finding Jesus at your youth ministry, can you call what the 1% was doing a success? If you could in their youth groups, in their churches. By that means what the 99% are doing just might be a failure, might just be something God's grace has to cover to compensate for, something that the efforts of the 1% can't touch because of their weakness and their need for Christ's strengths. Mapping success in ministry to technicalities is painful because it confronts us with this weakness. It means that numbers matter because those numbers map to people. It means that 99% of churches not doing real church and practicing an insufficient ecclesiology were wrong. Not winsome, not timely, not agreeable, not peaceful, wrong. And that 1% of churches doing the opposite were right. How do you fix this? Well, I rightly don't know. But I can take a guess at the youth group side of this consilience. A youth pastor makes enough in a year to fund a new high school teacher in waiting through an educational degree in every 2 years. What if 200 churches in a city all sent their youth pastors to teaching degrees and kept them employed afterwards until they secured a job in a school within their church's proximity for the youth group? An urban mission to which the likes of any city has never seen. There aren't 200 teaching positions available at any given point, but an army of 200 teachers to be waiting for that potential mission field would be a linchpin for the gospel progress in any city. Not because it's biblically based, not because it's a biblically based method, or because it's proven, but because it maps to what's already happening in the field in the other direction. Anti-Christian and post-Christian teachers are the norm for most high schools by hook and crook, and opposition to biblical youth age, 13 to 18, is also. But declaring that 1 to 2 hours a week at youth group is somehow going to compensate for 7 to 9 hours at school each day from people who deny our faith and actively teach against it at times is laughable. It's naive. And why would God's grace rest so heavily upon our youth groups? That naivety won't change the fact that lives were changed at your last youth retreat, that souls were saved after the worship night, and that students did grow deeper in their faith after Bible study. But it will mask the fact that a 1% ministry is statistically insignificant to a population unless it does in fact change the population. Unless it is in fact salt or light to the world, it's ground beef. So when the 1% of the church at large held fast, stayed open, and suffered scorn, prison, wrath, and at the very least need to ask if that 1% is making a difference, if that 1% is working. When we do that bit of math, we encounter a troubling statistic indeed. The 1% of churches that refused to be mandated and restricted, almost all doubled in size, saw growth on a level most churches only dream of by every metric churches used to use for success pre-COVID as well. They mapped their strategy to the realities of the God they worshipped and didn't let lesser magistrates change how they rendered anything to him. And Consilience comes back to echo that choice, as every church that chose to close or augment or downright alter their worship services during this challenging time used those metrics to call them a success before the first lockdown ever started. As Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting in the tax booth and said to him, "Follow me." And he rose and followed him. And Jesus reclined at the table in the house, and behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" But when he heard this, he said, "Those who are well are in no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I came to call the righteous, but sinners. For I came not to call the righteous, but sinners." Matthew 9:9-13, English Standard Version. How many tax collectors started going to churches that remained open? How many prostitutes to churches that did not have to hide their face in? How many adulterers and fornicators made it to church in person while others gathered exclusively online, right next to ashleymadison.com and Tinder? Maybe we'll never know, or be truly known for it, but you have to admit, this lines up nicely, doesn't it?